Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Charles David Keeling Lecture. I'm Evan DeLucia, a professor of plant biology here at the University of Illinois, and I also direct our Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and the Environment. The Institute, IC for short, was created to bring the best minds at the University of Illinois together across departmental boundaries to tackle grand challenges faced by society. We leverage the enormous academic strengths here at the University of Illinois to do three things: conduct interdisciplinary actionable research addressing grand challenges in energy and environment, train the next generation of scientists and leaders, and make campus a national model for sustainability. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about the Keeling Lecture. This event is named after Charles David Keeling, a 1948 graduate from the Department of Chemistry here at Illinois, who became renowned for making extremely precise measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These measurements clearly indicated that atmospheric concentrations were increasing, leading to the recognition that human activities could have a significant impact, and indeed are having a significant impact on the Earth's climate system. After receiving his PhD in chemistry from Northwestern in 1954, Keeling spent most of his career at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography until he passed away in 2005. As the first to confirm the accumulation of atmospheric CO2, he produced a data set now widely known as the Keeling Curve, which is illustrated for you on the board. And I was just looking at that. It's kind of sad to recognize that if we go back 2 more years, that's the change in carbon dioxide in my lifetime. So that's 1 lifetime's worth of atmospheric, well, hopefully it's not over yet. Well, maybe that rise in CO2 will be over, but the lifetime we want to keep going. So that's 1 lifetime's worth of CO2 rise in the atmosphere. To quote Charles Kennel, former Scripps director, his measurements are the single most important environmental data set taken in the 20th century. Keeling constructed one of the first models of the carbon cycle into which future man-made CO2 can be introduced to predict concentration levels in the air and water for decades to come. Each year, IC, the School of Chemical Sciences, the School of Earth, Society and Environment, the Department of Chemistry, and the Department of Atmospheric Sciences come together to sponsor a lecture on climate to honor Keeling's legacy. We're all pleased to welcome such a distinguished and accomplished speaker this year. Dr. Eban Goodstein is the director of the Center of Environmental Policy and the MBA in Sustainability program at Bard College in New York. Prior to taking these roles, he taught economics for 20 years at Lewis and Clark and Skidmore colleges. He is the co-author of the college textbook Economics and the Environment, now in its 8th edition, as well as the popular book The Trade-Off Myth: Fact and Fiction About Jobs and the Environment. His research has been featured in the New York Times, Scientific America, Time, Chemical and Engineering News, The Economist, and USA Today. He serves on the editorial board of Sustainability, the journal of record. From 2006 to 2009, Professor Goodstein led the national teach-in on global warming solutions, coordinating educational events at over 2,500 colleges, universities, and high schools and other institutions across the country. He now serves as board chair and co-director. We're excited to have him here tonight to deliver the 2018 Keeling Lecture, Climate Turns 30, Tribalism and Sustainability. Please join me in giving Dr. Eban Goodstein a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and truly an honor to give the Charles Keeling Lecture. Charles Keeling was a scientist in terms of his dedication to his data, and fought many political battles to get enough funding to maintain his observations at Mauna Loa, which in some ways prefigure the talk I want to give tonight. You can see that people began thinking seriously in an empirical fashion about the possibility of climate change back, beginning in 1958. But I want to argue that kind of as a cultural and social phenomenon, global warming turns 30 this year. That it was actually the year 1988 that it really emerged on the global scene as a cultural and political phenomenon. I remember the first time I ever heard about global warming. I was 21. It was 1981. I was in college, and I was part of an environmental group. And there was this guy named Al, I still remember Al, and he was like 30 and had long blonde hair and a guitar, and for some reason he was still hanging around college. And he showed up at our group. And I remember looking at him, and he was literally ashen-faced. He looked like a ghost. And he said, the US government scientists have proved it. There's this new study out, and there's this thing called the greenhouse effect, and the planet's going to heat up, and we're all doomed. And we were like, oh, that's just Al. That's just conspiracy theory Al. Don't pay any attention to him. It's not an issue. I mean, we'd never heard of global warming. We'd never heard of the greenhouse effect. This was the first time I'd ever heard of it. So we were all climate science deniers back then. But Al was right. This is the Charney report that had come out in 1979, and it was prescient in its prediction that if we doubled CO2 levels, we would heat the planet up about 3 degrees C, and that is still the kind of central estimate of the warming that we're going to face if we double, and obviously more than that if we go beyond the doubling. But that was really the first time I heard about climate change. Fast forward to '88, and it was an incredibly hot summer. I was writing my dissertation at the University of Michigan. Jim Hansen was on TV testifying before Congress that global warming was here, and suddenly it sort of emerged as this big existential threat that the planet was facing. And over the next dozen years or so, international teams of scientists went to work on this seriously, probably the biggest interdisciplinary science project in the history of humanity. And by the late 90s, the nails were firmly in the coffin, and you had incredibly dense and sophisticated scientific consensus confirming the science that Charney had sort of first officially identified back in 1979. So what I want to talk about today is not how the climate is changing, but how the changing climate is changing our culture and our society, and how over the last 30 years we've responded socially and politically to this new environment. And I really want to talk about 3 things. I want to talk about tribalism. I want to talk about kind of where we are at with climate change. I want to talk about how we got into sort of a tribal frame to think about this issue, and where that might take us. So that's an agenda for the day. So I want to talk about tribalism, and really here what I want to talk about is in-group, out-group dynamics, and argue, I think easily, that humans are hardwired for seeing things in a tribal frame. Through millions of years of evolution and by natural selection, we have powerful suites of emotions that into which we can sort of frame phenomena. So that, for example, we have emotions like love, loyalty, and friendship that can be mobilized fairly easily to get us to die for our tribe. And we have emotions like hatred, moral outrage, jealousy, that can be fairly easily mobilized to get us to kill for our tribe. And that is the history of humanity. There were good evolutionary reasons for that. When you put a cultural overlay on that, then tribalism morphs into religious identity, nationalist perspectives, and most of the great projects of human civilization have been founded on that kind of tribal identity and motivation to serve the community in one way or another. On the one hand, on the other hand, a lot of the very bad stuff that humans have done over the centuries has been similarly motivated. And all this came to a head really in the first half of the 20th century, where this tribalism was combined with modern weaponry to create truly sort of devastating, catastrophic outcomes. And so we had right-wing tribalism in Germany, we had left-wing tribalism in the Soviet Union with genocide. And then in the United States, tribalism has always had this kind of racial overlay. So this was the Ku Klux Klan in 1925, marching very openly in their robes down the streets of the Capitol. add nuclear weapons into the mix, and it created a different dynamic in the second half of the 20th century, where certainly elites became very alarmed about the direction these tribal movements were going. And so really the second half of the 20th century was very much a global century. And nationalist identity was tapped down, and we had the United Nations and the EU, common currency, very limited conflict between nation states. It was explicitly sort of pushed off into proxy wars. So actually, the second half of the 20th century was extremely peaceful as people, certainly elites in countries across the world, really began to try and step out of that tribal frame a little bit. But at the beginning of the 21st century, we've clearly had a reemergence of tribal identities, tribalism. And this is a global phenomenon that many people have said, and I think it's plausible to argue that it's really driven by technology, right? That the emergence of social media and kind of the ability to bypass elite media has created opportunities for people to mobilize tribal identities in innovative and dangerous ways for political and economic gain, right? I mean, this is how you build political movements or cultural movements from which leaders benefit, and either politically or economically. So I think it's really the technology that's allowed people to tap into what is a very human frame that's easy to exploit and easy to mobilize. It's new for us, and we don't really know how to understand it. We don't know how to control it, and we're obviously dealing with the ramifications of that right now. So again, it's global, and what we're seeing really, the primary form that tribalism is taking globally is in the form of right-wing nationalism. We're seeing it in Israel, in Turkey, in Hungary, in the Philippines, in India, in the UK, in Germany. So it's a global phenomenon that is, I think, taken most of us by surprise, because we grew up in that second half of the 20th century where it seemed like we were all progressing to some global happy community, by fits and starts. So in the US, it's the red-blue divide, and it's really much more complex than that. So this is population weighted, and I think it's also important to recognize that in red communities, that just means that 60% of the people vote Republican and 40% of the people vote Democratic, and in blue communities it's the reverse. So in spite of maps that kind of really scare you into thinking you're in foreign territory, it's just really not the case. We're a much more homogeneous culture than that. And yet, because we have a winner-take-all political culture, it materializes in the form of representation that's very red and blue, okay? What's really weird is that this scientific phenomenon, which we discussed a few minutes ago, has somehow gotten shoehorned into this tribal identity, right? So how did that come about? And what can we do about it? Why is it now that when we talk about climate change, people say, oh, well, Republicans don't accept the consensus science around global warming, and Democrats do. What a weird thing, right? How did we get there? And by the way, we're the only country in the world that has a major political party that doesn't accept the consensus climate science. The only political party in the world that doesn't accept consensus climate science. So this is a puzzle. We need to think about this, all right? I want to start off, though, kind of just recognizing the moment we're in and the reason we're here. This is the I think I want to make 2 points about what's new about climate change in the last 5 or 6 years. And the first one is that in the first, let's say, 20 years of global warming's existence, from 1988 to, say, 2008, global warming was something that was going to happen to us. But it, maybe Katrina, but it hadn't really happened to us yet. But now it's just clearly happening to us in the form of extreme weather event after extreme weather event after extreme weather event. You know, starting with the worst flooding that the Midwest has experienced in many, many years back in 2011. Massive forest fires pretty much every summer out west. Then the huge drought that you guys suffered through. Sandy. And then 2014 was the hottest year on record, until 2015 was the hottest year on record, until 2016 was the hottest year on record. And this year, we had 5 record-breaking tropical hurricanes in the space of 1 month. So unusual to get 5 massive hurricanes, but 5 record-breaking hurricanes. They were all record-breaking on different dimensions. And the one in Puerto Rico was the most devastating. And you know, it's 7 months after that hurricane, and 30% of the people on that island do not have electric power, right? Imagine if 30% of the people in Illinois didn't have electric power, right? We wouldn't, that's unacceptable. We would be mobilizing the National Guard. We would be doing all kinds of stuff to fix that. These are US citizens, but they're second-class US citizens, and so nobody cares. Right? There is no federal initiative to fix this in any kind of a hurry. And I think it's indicative of kind of the challenges that we face in a climate world where Texas gets hammered, Florida gets hammered, and Puerto Rico gets hammered. And who's going to be left out of the equation? I think it's pretty clear. So the climate justice questions are beginning to sort of stare us deeply in the face. And, on the other side, this was an economy that wasn't working well for people in the first place, right? They had a terrible electric grid where they were importing fuel oil into Puerto Rico from halfway around the world, being refined elsewhere, burning it for electric power, people facing blackouts all the time. So because of the fact that solar energy is now so cheap, and battery storage is getting there, we're at a moment where it's quite possible to envision rewiring Puerto Rico more cheaply with solar and wind than it would be to rebuild the grid. So we can imagine a future for Puerto Rico, and Puerto Ricans are doing this, where they have a distributed energy system that's much more resilient to the kind of hurricanes and sea level rise that they're going to be experiencing in the future. And that's a good metaphor for the rest of the world. That's an island, we're an island. And so we're at this moment where we'd have 2 futures ahead of us, right? I mean, more broadly speaking, we're living at this moment where, 10,000 years of human history are crashing in the next 3 decades. And we have got to figure out how we're going to meet the needs of what will soon be 10 billion people in a world where of the 7.5 billion alive today, half of those folks are barely getting by, and everybody's aspiring to a good quality of life, and we're already fighting over water and oil and topsoil and fish and forests and biodiversity, and the oceans are getting more acidic, and it's getting hotter all the time. Are you guys in the right room? Yeah. Do you want to leave? I mean, this is kind of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, but we're also at this kind of unique position where we can actually see a different future. And I think that's the other kind of exciting thing about the moment we're living in, is that 5 years ago, you could talk about a clean energy future and you could sort of wave your hands around it. But we've seen such dramatic cost reductions in solar. It's clear that electric vehicles are the transportation option. Battery storage is falling in rapidly. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I do want to show one more picture. So this is the consequences of the Keeling curve, right? But the thing that I think is most stunning about the last few years, and the most underreported fact, is that from 2014 to 2016, the planet heated up, whoops, wrong way, 0.5 degree Fahrenheit in 3 years. Global temperatures rose 0.5 degree Fahrenheit in 3 years. How many of you knew that? I'm just curious. Isn't that incredible that you don't know that? The media has somehow dropped the ball on this. This is an astounding fact, and it's a fact. It's based in scientific data gathered by the NASA, and we don't know this, right? So we have to talk about why that is in a minute. So here's the this is the consequences of the moment we're living in, right? So this is 10,000 years of human history. This is our best reconstruction of global temperatures. This is from science. And what you can see is that for the last 10,000 years, global average temperatures have barely, wavered half a degree Fahrenheit in either direction. And this is all of human history, right? This is the animal husbandry, and the first cities are right here. And, right here is the iPhone, okay? Maybe right here, okay? And so humans have actually our civilization has developed on the backs of an incredibly stable climate system. It wasn't before then, ice ages and not, but we've been very fortunate to be not only in a warm period, but also quite stable period. But this is the brick wall that we're running into. And, the best, well, there's that half a degree in 3 years. In 3 years. The best we can do, we really put our minds to this, like dramatically, we could stop it at 2 degrees C. If we meet the Paris Accord targets, which we're not, because we pulled out of Paris and we're not doing what we need to do to meet the 2025 goals, globally we would get to that point. And if we blow past Paris and kind of revert to business as usual, this is where we're heading, by the time my grandchild is not much older than me. Okay, so, and this is the science that has become tribal in some profound way. Okay? All right, so you're completely depressed now. I'm sorry. So now I'm going to give you the good news. Okay? And so, suppose I told you that we're going to wake up in 2030 and actually this problem is going to be completely solved, at least on the energy side. And there's a guy named Tony Seba who, what I urge you, I'm not going to talk much about solutions here, except maybe in the Q&A. Just Google Tony Seba, watch one of his videos, and you're going to walk away feeling much better about the state of the world, at least on the climate side. Okay, so Tony starts his video with, here's an image of New York City, Fifth Avenue, 1900. There is one car in this picture, but it's all horses, right? 13 years later, it's all cars. There's no horses. Okay? And what Tony says is that as a consequence of the fundamental economics of solar and battery-powered cars, electric vehicles, and rideshare, that by 2030, which is 12 years from now, the planet will be effectively 100% solar-powered, driverless electric vehicles. And then all that sort of running off the backs of cheap batteries. Okay? And the basic story is, for 50 years, we've been subsidizing solar and to a lesser extent batteries. And prices have been dropping very regularly at 16% every time you double installed global capacity. We're doubling capacity every 3 or 4 years. So you're seeing, we're at this point now where utility scale solar is coming in at 1.7 cents a kilowatt hour in Saudi Arabia. It's more competitive in the US than any other new electricity source. Rooftop solar is close. But if you take that out 4 or 5 or 6 years, it's going to be way cheaper than natural gas. And at some point, it's going to be cheaper than, solar plus batteries is going to be cheaper than even transmitted electricity. So capital is going to flow in. People are going to make a lot of money. We're going to transform the global energy system in 13 years. Okay, think about that for a while. Watch the video, Tony Seba, just Google him, okay? And it'll make, now, is it true? I mean, we could talk about that in the Q&A, but it's kind of the best case scenario for we've actually already fixed this problem. We've actually done the technology work we need to do to set up the economics to let the market take over. You may be right, you may not be. Tony Seba. Okay, so let's get back to the tribal story. And what's really interesting about the tribal division around climate change is it's weirdly un-American. At least from the perspective of the 20th century. So the partisanship that we're experiencing right now is just a totally new phenomenon. So through almost all of the 20th century, there was a very strong bipartisan consensus that government needed to take action to promote stewardship of natural resources, conservation, protect the environment, create anti-pollution laws. Going back to Teddy Roosevelt, Republican president at the turn of the century created the national parks, the national forest system, soil conservation in the 1930s, 1960s. You had this incredible wave of environmental regulation. And this was all very bipartisan. So if you go back to when I was 11 years old, it's the first Earth Day, there were 20 million Americans outside in the streets demanding action to clean up the environment. Now, 20 million Americans haven't done anything together except watch the Super Bowl since that day, probably. And as a consequence of that kind of public concern, Richard Nixon, Republican president, signed into law Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, created the EPA. Republican President Ronald Reagan passed into law Superfund, the Toxic Release Inventory, negotiated and signed an international treaty to protect the ozone layer. And then Republican President George H.W. Bush signed into law the first major experiment in cap and trade systems, the sulfur dioxide trading system for acid rain, and created a regulatory structure for air toxics. And his team negotiated and signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which committed the global community to engaging around this issue, determining the scientific basis for action, and then taking further steps. That process in turn set up the Conference of the Parties, the meetings every year, which eventually led in 2015, 25 years later, or 23 years later, to the Paris Climate Accord that President Obama signed, which for the first time committed all the nations of the earth to action on climate change. Everybody stepped up and said, here's what we're going to do, and that was the Paris target. Okay? So you had this amazing 25-year run in the United States of significant environmental legislation that was very bipartisan. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change passed this, it was ratified by the Senate 95-0. Can you imagine a treaty on global warming passing the US Senate 95-0? Not possible in our day and age, but this was not that long ago, all right? But if you look at what's come out of Washington since that time, there's really nothing. Most of the work that President Obama did was under legislation that had been created in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so again, we've got a puzzle. You can see this very clearly in the data. So this is just some of it. Since 1974, the Gallup poll has been asking Americans, do you believe that the government is spending too little on the environment? In other words, should the government spend more on the environment? The way they phrase it is weird. And if you go back to 1974, about 68% of Democrats said the government should be doing more. 58% of Republicans said the government should be doing more. And support for environment dips a little bit during the economic difficulties of the late 70s, early 80s. Climate change is born here in 1988. Look at this number. 1990, you had 75% of Democrats and 75% of Republicans saying the government should do more to protect the environment. And this was the period of consensus, right? So, Republicans were a little less supportive, but they were pretty supportive. And so you had, really sort of an ability to sort of address problems. But then beginning in 1990, something happened, right? Democratic public opinion stayed very constant, about 75%. But Republican opinion really began to tail off. By 2012, you're down at 40%. And if you follow that line out, it's probably about 30% of Republicans would self-identify as environmentalists now, as people who think we have environmental problems that the government ought to be doing more to address. Now, it's still 30%. That's a significant minority, and there's a lot of active Republicans who are trying to reverse this trend, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But clearly, this is the partisan divide that we're seeing. Okay, how did that happen? And I could give a whole long talk on this, so I'm going to kind of give you the Cliff Note versions of this. Basically, the story is we've had a widening partisan divide along a whole number of issues, which, again, I'm going to attribute primarily to the rise of new media, It was originally talk radio, and then it became cable television, and then it became, the sort of social media monster that we have now. And that really enabled the rise of, on the right, of a very sort of cohesive ideology that sort of defined who was a conservative and who wasn't. So there's a technology piece, but there's also a money piece directly related to the climate change question. So I want to look at that a bit. It goes back to the early 1970s. There was a guy named Lewis Powell who was later appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. And Powell in 1971 wrote a very famous memo called the Powell Memo to the head of the US Chamber of Commerce. And so I want you to put yourselves in the shoes of a free market conservative in the early 1970s. This was not a good time, right? The 60s had been liberalism ascendant. You had the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and you had consumer rights and women's rights and regulation coming to business on all fronts. And so you're really worried, this is socialism on the march. Conservatives are not dealing with this well. We're getting defeated right and left. So we need to have a cohesive conservative movement that can push back against the liberal movement. And that was Powell's argument. It was very influential, and it attracted funding from a bunch of right-wing and also libertarian, at that time 100 millionaires, now billionaires. The Koch brothers got involved at this time. This is when they started putting money into the system. And basically what they said, well, we've got to begin to define what a conservative movement is all about. We can't have any of these wishy-washy moderate conservatives anymore. We have to really nail down what conservatives stand for. And they basically began to create sort of what the modern conservative, and there's been a process by which that identity has kind of moved further and further rightward as kind of the tribal process has sort of played out. But that was really the beginning of movement conservatism and the idea of kind of a conservative identity in the United States. Now, in the 70s and 80s, you began to see a political process in which fossil fuel and these libertarian dollars began to flow into the political process and began to challenge moderate conservatives, calling them rhinos. So Republican in name only, that's a rhino. And because of our political structure, they would be challenged from the right by people who were more true conservatives. And slowly those moderates got picked off, kind of one by one. And you saw a transformation on the right in this direction of people who were sort of towing the line on abortion and guns and the whole sort of litmus test of kind of conservative positions. And the fossil fuel and libertarian folks worked hard to make sure that pro-environment conservatives were getting removed. That traditional conservative concern for conservation was sort of being edged out. And that sort of part of being a part of the conservative tribal identity was, I think, that environmental regulations are hampering business, and there's overreach, and they're constraining individual freedom, and they're crippling American business, and they're sort of the product of a science academic kind of elite conspiracy to gain more funding for research. And that sort of story and that kind of meme began to sort of be part of the conservative identity. Ronald Reagan appointed the first two real, if you think about it, environmentalism in the 60s and 70s was like Apple and Mom and apple pie. But the first two politicians to really speak out against it were Reagan appointees, James Watt in 1981 and Ann Gorsuch, the mother of Neil Gorsuch, who's our new Supreme Court justice, were the first people to really articulate that. She was head of EPA, kind of like a Scott Pruitt of the day. They didn't last long because it was a very controversial position back then, but it slowly became kind of the part of that conservative identity. And that's really the story of how what was historically a very strong bipartisan concern for the environment slowly eroded. As I've talked about media bubbles. These are reinforcing identities on the right and on the left, important. In the 90s, when climate change really began to sort of appear on the screen, so this was in the 80s that this stuff first started, but in the 90s, you had kind of another wave of fear on the part of big business, and particular fossil fuel related industries, oil, coal, automobiles, that dealing with climate change was an existential threat, and not only to their industries, but to the whole free market system. If we were going to deal with this issue, this was going to mean government control of the economy. And I don't believe that, as I kind of suggested, but you don't have to go far to find environmentalists who'll say that. So Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, it's very popular on college campuses. The subtitle is Capitalism versus the Climate. And Joe Rome often talks about we need, World War II style mobilization. So that kind of language was pretty frightening to business. So they began to kind of push back against the potential for any kind of climate action in Washington, D.C. There was actually an industry consortium called the Global Climate Coalition that actively lobbied against action on climate change. That broke up under consumer pressure, but the Koch brothers and the fossil fuel industry funneled about $500 million, no, was it about 10, I think it was, I'm not sure about the number, some large number, like in the billions of dollars, into another round of kind of institution building and the Heartland Institute and kind of the skeptic community to fund the story that global warming was kind of a Chinese hoax, or, in spite of all that, the mainstream of the Republican Party stayed pro-environment and pro-action on climate until 2008. So if you go back just 10 years ago, the last two men standing in the Republican presidential primary, Mitt Romney and John McCain, had both been climate action champions. Romney, when he was governor of Massachusetts, had joined the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. McCain actually had bills, cap and trade bills, named after him in the Senate. So the mainstream of the party was still hanging on to that, we got to worry about environmental issues, until 2010, or 2008, 2010, when Obama won, and in 2010 in particular with the Tea Party wave that brought Republican control of the House of Representatives, it just became too dangerous for any Republican politicians to be pro-climate action. And I'll give you a case study of that in a minute. And Romney actually flipped. By 2012, he was opposed to action on climate change, and McCain has basically never talked about it again, as far as I can tell. Hasn't issued a word about climate change for 10 years, even though it had been a signature issue for him. So that's pretty much the story. I guess the other piece that is important here is that a lot of the movement conservative rhetoric has been very anti-elitist. And the elites in this case are politicians, the media, and folks at universities. So again, the meme was, climate change is invented by scientists because they get more research funding if they sort of promote that idea. And it also, and it's sort of, that kind of anti-elitism made it easy to kind of reject consensus climate science, right? Who are those people to tell me what's happening in the world? I mean, it's snowing in the winter. It's cold in December. How can there be global warming? That sort of common sense kind of appeal to people to sort of help them understand, well, it's just made up. It's a conspiracy, right? Anti-elitism is a big part of American politics on both sides. Bernie Sanders, who was his elites? Millionaires and billionaires. He has his own people that he's trying to demonize. So it happens all over the place, but it was particularly conducive to allowing people to reject sort of a science-based approach and adopt a more tribalistic perspective. And then finally, 2016, really not 18, was in many sense kind of the triumph of the fossil fuel sort of attempt to ensure that conservatives really bought into this identity. Of the 17 candidates who were running on the Republican ballot in 2016, there was only one who argued for action on climate change. It was Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. He was the only one. So, basically the triumph was complete. And now, we had the head of ExxonMobil, as Secretary of State. We've got the, former Attorney General of Oklahoma as head of the EPA, et cetera, et cetera. So it really was, in many senses, the triumph of the fossil fuel industry. Their people are, their stamp is all over what's happening in Washington. And the very first thing that the Trump administration was able to get done was to pull out of Paris, even over the objections of the former head of ExxonMobil. So that's how we got here. Can we go back? Are we stuck? So that's the movement conservative tribe. I want to talk a little bit about the centrist tribe. What's happening there? Well, if there's going to be sort of a centrist dialogue, we know that it will come from kind of the traditional conservative roots of care for the earth, right? There's still that 30% of Republicans. There used to be 70%. And if you kind of uncover, what was the source of that conservation ethic, a part of it is religious. So, you've got sort of a creation care ethic. On the recurrent service side, a lot of hunters and fishers, people that are worried about habitat and protection. That's historically been true. The military. You got tons of, military folks, CIA folks who get this, are talking about it all the time. James Mathis, Secretary of Defense, is probably the only outspoken climate action advocate in Trump's cabinet. Energy self-reliance is appealing to conservatives. There was an attempt in Georgia to roll back solar subsidies, and the Tea Party joined with the Sierra Club to create the green tea movement. And we're able to get some action done. Business sustainability, this is a new phenomenon. This is no longer, business versus the environment. It's the fossil fuel sector versus the climate. And most of the large corporations in the world have embraced climate action. They've got their own climate action plans. They've got people in the companies. When Trump tried to pull out of Paris, or did pull out of Paris, there were 30 CEOs that wrote a very public letter to him asking him to stay in. There's bipartisan support for renewables because wind and solar is good for rural communities. There's technology leadership. There's market-friendly approaches. So I think the real question for the centrist tribe is what happens post-Trump. So that if Trump faces a blue wave in November, and just kind of goes down in flames and really sort of disappears in 2020 as a political force, will these people be able to kind of find each other and realign and pull the Republican Party back on this issue? Or will they feel like there's no home for themselves in the Republican Party and defect to the Democrats? And they're very frustrated because they don't really have a space in kind of the movement conservative world anymore. And of course, this is really what, in the end of the day, is going to create the centrist tribe. It's going to keep getting hotter, and at some point, the U.S. is going to rejoin the rest of the world and engage in some substantive way. But I'm going to talk about one individual in this context. This is Bob Inglis, and he's kind of an example of this process. So he was a very conservative congressman from South Carolina, but in 2008, he sort of got engaged in the climate issue from an evangelical kind of Christian stewardship perspective, and in 2008 voted for a carbon cap and trade bill. He was one of 8 Republicans to vote for it. In 2010, he was, target of massive, spending by the fossil fuel industry to make sure he was gone. He lost his election. to someone who was a true conservative. He was accused of being a Rhino. And he started this thing called Republican. He said, we opened up shop in July 2012. For our first couple of years, we spoke with thousands of conservatives and free market advocates around the country. We discovered that a robust constituency exists for conservative leadership on clean energy and climate change. So that's that 30% that still exists. And by the way, Charles Keeling was, I've learned, a lifelong Republican. So he very much fit into this older bipartisan mode of kind of Republican thought. And they found three things. They're energy optimists, confident that market-driven innovation can accelerate an energy revolution. So it's not climate versus capitalism. It's capitalism saves the climate, right? That's the frame that's going to be comfortable for centrists. They're climate realists, compelled by the evidence that climate risk requires risk management. So they get the climate change thing. They're going to phrase it in the business-friendly language of risk management. And here's the tribal piece. They're pumped to learn that they are not all alone. Right? These folks have been feeling very lonely in this process, 25-year process of kind of moving the Republican Party into climate denialism. And these Republicans are finding each other, and they're trying to build a new tribe. So that's kind of the centrist tribe. And I think the point here is, if you're kind of a Democrat or a liberal, there's very little you can do to influence this process. This has got to be an internal process among sort of conservatives and centrists. They've got to figure out how to rebuild their tribe. They're not going to listen to people from outside the tribe about how to do that. So it'll be curious to see how in a post-Trump world they are able to do that. So I want to end up on kind of this idea of that I've been describing tribalism as a dangerous thing, but ultimately it is a tribal sensibility that might save us, right? Because the really cool thing about climate change, in some ways, is that it's energized the sustainability tribe. And that tribe sort of feels that everybody's in their tribe, right? So that's my perspective, is that the whole planet is my tribe. Everybody alive and all the creatures on the planet and everybody who's going to live in the future. So I've expanded my tribal identity to the best I can, and I can't always do it, but I like to think inclusively about those people being my tribe. Why do I, work on climate change? Because I'm worried about my tribe. Climate change is like the asteroid strike. It's the existential threat that's mobilizing millions of people around the world to focus their energies on solving this problem, whether it's through politics or policy or business or education. And it's ultimately those tribal instincts of love and loyalty and friendship and love that motivates the big tribe. And what's interesting is that before climate change existed, there was kind of that sentiment, kind of that global sentiment, if you will. And it took the form originally of a UN book called Our Common Future back in 1987. And then it took the form of the Millennium Development Goals. And more recently, it's taken the form of the Sustainable Development Goals, which probably many of you are familiar with. And what climate change has done really is put energy behind all of these goals: poverty elimination, education, gender equality, industry innovation and infrastructure, life below water, life on land. All of these, you can work on all of these sustainable development goals and be solving the climate change problem in a way that no other sustainable development goals can claim that kind of unifying sort of force. And the sustainability tribe is pretty cool. I mean, it's got artists and CEOs, it's got, activists and business people, it's got indigenous folks, and it's truly a global movement. And so at the end of the day, it's natural, that we've responded to climate change, a scientific phenomenon, a policy phenomenon, in a tribal way because we're tribal people. And I think that the question mark really for us is which tribe wins? So that's kind of where I want to leave it. I want to talk to the students in the audience for just a minute about tribal leadership, and actually invite you to come to Bard College the first weekend of December or the first weekend of March next year, or the year after if you're a sophomore or a freshman. We hold weekend training workshops for folks who aspire to sustainability leadership in business, policy, politics, NGO. And it's a fabulous weekend. If you can get there, we'll put you up and feed you for $30. And we'll spend the weekends, like starts Friday at 5 and ends Sunday at noon, really working on these kind of core skills for tribal leadership. It's a fabulous weekend. You're going to be with 40 other people from around the country, and begin to self-identify, as tribal leaders, and begin to develop the skills you need to lead the tribe. So if you'd like more information about that, and this is for undergraduates and recent graduates. So it's sort of 18 to 26 is kind of the age group, or 28. We typically have somebody in their 30s, but that's kind of the primary group that we're looking at. If you'd like more information, please sign up here. We'll send stuff on to the ICE, and I'm sure it'll get circulated through that. I also want to talk about something I talked with earlier with the students about, is we need leadership in all dimensions. And when I think about sort of careers in this space, like devoting your life to solving this problem, because even if we fix it in the next 13 years in the energy sector, we still got a lot of problems, that there's 3 big ways that you can do that. You can do it through policy, changing the rules of the game and getting rid of bad laws and regulations and putting in place good laws and regulations. You can do it through education, changing minds. Or you can do it through business. And you think, well, why is business in that solutions bucket? Because, at the end of the day, no matter how many rules we change and how many minds we change, we've got to figure out how we're going to, feed 10 billion people, get their lights on, get the heat they need, healthcare, all that stuff's got to happen, which means over the next 10, 15, 20 years, business has got to radically reinvent itself, and be able to produce those goods and services in ways that have dramatically lower ecological footprint, but also that treat workers and communities with justice and with respect, because you can't have one without the other. So we need to pursue a radical reimagination of business as we change the rules and change minds. Fortunately, we offer graduate degrees in all 3 of those spaces. I'd love to talk more about them with you, but it's really, these are the things you can do. You can change the rules, you can change minds, or you can change the game. So let's go back to why nobody's heard that the planet's heated up 0.5 degree Fahrenheit in 3 years. This is a map that shows how often adults discuss global warming occasionally, right? Occasionally. And it doesn't really rise above 25%. It is not a topic of conversation, which means the fossil fuel industry has won. They have politicized this issue, so it's like religion and politics. You do not talk about global warming. It's not polite, right? The media doesn't report on it because it's too controversial. So they've won. You can obviously push back against this and talk about global warming anytime you can, any opportunity you get. Make a pest of yourself. Be an irritable person. Try and do it with some humor. Try and figure out creative ways to do it. Don't be like, you need to cut your carbon footprint. Don't preach, but just engage people in this because it matters, right? You say, look, this really matters to me. Can we talk about it? Speak from your heart, engage people in the conversation. So I want to kind of leave you with that. And again, I think they've only won very temporarily. The coal industry is dying. Within 8 or 9 years, the fossil fuel industry will be dying. They've got billions, trillions of dollars in stranded assets, and investors are going to figure that out, and we're going to be moving to an electric, renewable future. So, we're going to get there. The question is, how fast. So I'm going to end on this picture. So that's me when I first heard about global warming, or the next year. So that was when I was your age. I was 21, 22. And I put this picture up here just to remind you kind of like how fast life, this seems like yesterday for me. So you're going to wake up before you know it, and you're going to be 58, and your life is going to go on by. And you want to make sure that you actually use it well and productively. We need you making a difference in your 20s because we don't have a lot of time. The other thing that'll really freak you out is that soon after this picture is taken, this picture was taken. So these things happen to you sometimes, maybe not to everybody, but they do happen. So that's Emma. Emma is 30. So she was born the same year as climate change. And so when climate change is 60, she'll be 60. And it'll be the year 2048. And at that moment, we're really going to know the future of the Earth in a really profound way, right? We're going to know, did we figure out how we were going to meet the needs of those 10 billion people? And we're going to learn more fundamentally how hot it's going to get. And whether global warming is going to drive the planet, another 2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter, or another 4 or 6. I talk about global warming and mass extinction all the time, and people say, doesn't that depress you? Doesn't that kind of leave you hopeless? And it doesn't, because in many ways there's never been a more exciting and decisive time to be alive as a human, because we can see those two futures, and we all have the opportunity to fight for the one that we believe in. And we're not facing dogs and fire hoses and beatings and blacklistings to do that kind of work. And we have amazing tools and networks and opportunities. So thank you all for being here today. You are the future, and I look forward to working with you in one capacity or another.
Sure, Dr. Goodstein will entertain some questions.
Yeah. Yes.
A couple signs that things already are changing is about a month ago, 5 major oil companies announced that they accept the science of climate change. And since then, Shell actually came out with a report showing a potential plan for changing energy and transportation systems to meet those goals of making a sustainable world. Secondly, Congress, it's not very large yet, but there is the Climate Coalition Caucus, which currently has 74 members, and a Democrat can't join until a Republican does. And we're getting about 2 a month, roughly, being added to that at this point. And so it's even gradually changing in Congress.
Yeah. I think that the Congress, that caucus is going to shrink dramatically in November, because most of those members are in pretty dangerous districts and are liable to lose their seats. But it'll grow after that, because you'll get a strong political signal that you need to move in this direction. But I think the immediate effect of the November elections is going to be to shrink that caucus, at least in the short run. Other questions? Yeah.
So you talk a lot about tribalism and all that. As it evolved, tribalism has been such a small knit group of hunter-gatherers and moving through. Are you concerned at all that we're not evolved enough to be able to see tribalism as everybody and our common man and everything under the sun, or do we need to find some other entity like the almighty dollar to rally behind?
We need to certainly develop profitable solutions to this problem. This is not a kumbaya kind of problem. But I think that what motivates the people who are working, devoting their lives to solving this problem is not the money. It's the love of the planet and their fellow people. This is the Enlightenment project, right? Thomas Jefferson proudly declared all men are created equal. And it's taken, hundreds of years now for us to kind of get to the point where that is really not true yet. But the whole sort of history of America has been about the unfolding of that ideal, which was patently not true when he said it. So the American project has been about expanding the definition of tribe. That's what we do, that's what we believe in, and we've done it, not quite to the, not to Puerto Rico yet, but, we're getting there. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that will be the default sort of mindset in 2300. That's the evolution of human identity towards the global tribe. Yeah.
So if there's a divide within the sustainability movement, at least one divide is between the pro-growth cohort and the anti-growth cohort. And that's to characterize the anti-growth cohort, or their position is that there's no compatibility between climate safety and pro-growth economics. That's simply even tweaking at the margins of emissions and developing new technologies, it will not be sufficient, and that what's required is a different paradigm where we're looking at getting smaller and moving out of the perpetual growth sort of machine.
Yeah.
Just looking for your thoughts.
I think that's such a utopian perspective that I frankly find most people who say that to be like really depressing to be around. If that's what's got to happen, why am I even doing anything? People have been sort of forever kind of preaching that sort of line of argument. And there are certainly people on the margins who want to adopt a simpler lifestyle and, voluntary simplicity and all that stuff. But I just don't see it. And I think it's a recipe for like self-defeating pessimism. Just puts you in a box that you just become a grumpy person. So I hope I didn't offend anybody who takes that perspective. But that really is, I just really don't talk to those people because it's like, okay, what do I do? There's nothing I can do except for maybe try and educate people. But, I have family in Korea. I fly to Korea to see them. I'm not going to stop that. And that gives me a giant carbon footprint. I can't preach to other people that they need to cut their emissions. This is a technology problem that we have to solve one way or the other. Sure, we need consciousness raising and people need to make more sensitive in their consumer choices, and they are, but it's very slow, and we don't have that kind of time. On the growth side, what I would say is there's great opportunity to grow the good stuff and shrink the bad stuff. There may be physical limits on GDP growth, but you can grow GDP by using resources way more efficiently. So I just think the whole growth argument is just sort of, just takes you nowhere. Yeah.
So you talked about technology and basically, can capitalism take us out of it and technology take us out of it? What about policy? We've rolled back the Clean Power
absolutely.
Plan. Do we need it? Or?
We need lots of policy change. I think what's really interesting about this moment is that at least on the solar front, policy has been working effectively for 50 years to drive a product that was invented by the US government and supported by policy initiatives in China and Germany and Spain and the US government, and it's been super effective. But we're at this tipping point now where, policy's done its work, and we're close to the point where solar won't really need policy anymore. It'll just be way cheaper than natural gas, and that's when the market can really take over and do what markets do well, which is spread profitable solutions really fast. Now, in other arenas, you still need policy. Batteries, for example, they've got a ways to go. Although there's a lot of sort of market-driven research in that space now. And the solar issue is going to be probably more about getting rid of bad policy than putting in place good policy. So I've got a solar installer friend who was trying to put up a community solar thing in our little town. And there was some guy that just moved up from New York City and was opposed to having this solar installation across the street from his house. And he was saying, I'm really worried about all the trucks. And the guy says, well, there's not going to be any trucks. He says, well, I'm really worried about the noise. He says, there's not going to be any noise. I'm really worried about, all the emissions. And there's not going to be any emissions. But still, he just didn't want that thing across the street from him. So, there's going to be that's a policy question, right? Can you stop that if you want to? And on what grounds? So there's an incredible amount of policy work that has to be done. And in my mind, that's why Tony Seba's probably wrong. That, trying to just install that much solar, in terms of space, you're going to get a lot of pushback that, is going to have to be worked through. And sort of new regulatory structures are going to have to be put in place to sort of address, I don't want a giant solar farm probably on my property either. So how do you kind of work through those things?
One more question actually before, but while since the 1990s you've sort of seen this, as you showed, this erosion of support for climate change in the US, but at the same time you've seen this incredible support in the rest of the world, with China and Korea and other places having emissions trading programs, and what is which is completely flipped. And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. If you told me 5 years ago that China was going to be the global leader on climate, 5 years ago it was like, China, oh my God, they're building 2 coal plants a week. We'll never solve this problem. And they stopped doing that, and we solved that problem. They're still building coal plants in Indonesia, so that's a problem. The Chinese are. But, it's amazing how what seems like an intractable problem has just disappeared. This is a signature of the fossil. We're a petro state, and the only other Western countries where you saw similar kind of political dynamics were Canada and Australia. So it's been fossil fuel politics that has nothing else, right? That's the difference between the United States and everywhere else. Because everywhere else has got these right-wing nationalist movements and people worried about globalization and immigration and stuff. But nobody else has wedged climate change into that. And the fossil fuel industry set about doing it, and they did it very effectively.
Yes. In your presentation, excuse me, you emphasized the situation in the United States. And toward the end of your presentation, you indicated the importance, in your perspective, being in the sustainable tribe. And I would like to get your thoughts at the global level, and with increase in population by 2030 up to about 10 billion people, with the most rapid rise in economic development taking place in the underdeveloped countries, Africa and Asia and so forth. I'm thinking in terms of thinking as a sustainable tribe. You've indicated the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I see the Paris Accords being an example of all of us getting in a sustainable tribe. So my question is, given the urgency of the problem, how do you see this taking place on a global level, going to more sustainable energy in developing countries like Africa and Asia and Middle East, et cetera?
I think actually it's kind of like cell phones, right? Cell phones have spread globally. It's not a developed country phenomenon. It's not an underdeveloped country. And in fact, they're probably more powerful tools in a developing country context because they provide banking services and healthcare services. So the iPhone is only. Anybody know when the iPhone first came out? Smartphones. 10 years ago. 10 years ago. We didn't have that technology 10 years ago. Now it's ubiquitous globally. So again, it's this idea of how fast these things can scale. Developing countries aren't stringing electric wires all over the place to have landlines, right? They went right to cell technology. And so solar is massively advantageous to countries that, building centralized infrastructure is a real political challenge and nightmare. And if you can install cheap distributed energy, it's fabulous. So let me show you this picture, which I didn't before. This is kind of the Tony Seba story. So let me just take you through it quickly. So this is what's been happening to solar power costs in the US every time you double installed capacity. It's what economists call a learning curve. So every time you double installed capacity, costs of electricity fall by about 16%. Okay? Now we've been doing that, for a long time, and you could extend that further back. Here, this is like 2019, all right? And this would be maybe rooftop solar or something. You can see that utility scale solar is already like killing the competition. If you can do utility scale solar, it's absolutely the cheapest thing you can install these days. This is kind of more like rooftop stuff, and we're at this sort of tipping point where we're about to get cheaper than new natural gas. We're not quite there yet. If you want to put panels on your rooftop, you still need to subsidize. You need some subsidies and whatnot. But we're pretty close, right? So this is going to be the solution for developing countries. They're going to get access to power that's, 4x cheaper than, new natural gas within 15 or 16 years. If you believe that this curve is going to keep doing what it's doing, that you're going to get that 16% drop every time you double.
Will we be part of that?
We who?
The United States.
Yeah, I mean,
it's going to take a massive implementation.
But the point is that once you get to here, you make a lot of money if you implement. Mm-hmm. So when you get into this range, anybody, and you get batteries doing the same thing, Seba refers to that as God parity, not grid parity. When you get solar plus storage cheaper than transmitted electricity, then anybody who has any access to capital is going to make a lot of money by essentially unhooking from the grid and self-generating with storage. And so this is the revolution that he sees coming in the next 5 to 10 years. And if it happens, it's going to, and this is plus a move to 100% autonomous vehicles that are electric. And cheap batteries. So that's the technology disruption he sees coming that would cause us to wake up in 2030 and say, hey, we solved that problem, at least on the energy side. We still got ag and forests, but how will it go this fast? Who knows? But it's a very hopeful sort of perspective on the climate change front, so I'd urge you to watch the video just to get a better sense of the story.
Well, I think we should probably wrap it up now, so please join me in thanking Professor Goodstein once again.